Hey folks, welcome to the show. The camera angle's pretty weird, but that's because I'm on StreamYard tonight, so we can try this fancy new StreamYard tool. Welcome everybody to the show. This is Counter Clipping show number 71 for April 25th, 2022. Next big thing we got coming up is Origins, and we're going to do a pre-Origins event. But not tonight. Tonight we're going to talk about fantasy and sci-fi war games. So, and I'll talk a little bit more about what I kind of want to explore in that space, which is kind of more along the lines of the kind of stuff that Avalon Hill and SPI were doing, rather than a lot of the modern fantasy-esque type things. So we are drinking. I don't have the normal cards and stuff because I'm not paying for StreamYard. So this is part of the evaluation period. It's expensive to make it work. And if we look a little fuzzier this week, that's because we're in glorious 720 instead of 1080, which we usually are in. We're drinking Oban Little Bay. We are clipping. Pull the box up here. We are clipping Barbarossa Army Group Center 2nd edition, and we are clipping them into the fancy new Aegis counter trays, which, we're going to, I think, really get the most out of the... Honestly, there might be a little too much space in these trays for this game. We'll see, but right now I'm out of GMT trays, so I guess we can not talk about that. At some point, also coming up, we're going to talk again about American Revolution, because I've been doing some reading on American Revolution, and I feel like I have a little bit better grasp of the topic than I did last time we talked about that, which I'm not sure that was on here or the show with Dan. We are no longer doing a formal channel of the week, so check out the channels tab on the channel page. So you can check that out. This shirt looks dirty. It's clean, damn it. It's kind of schmutz on it. I don't know what the hell it is. Anyway, it's probably cheese of some kind. So I think we're going to be hitting the Oban Little Bay until it's gone, because I'd like to free up the space for a potential trip down to Kentucky. So we're going to talk about fantasy and science fiction war games, probably some other stuff. And we're going to do one giveaway tonight. I didn't get last week's giveaways out, so we're going to shoot to do that this weekend, and I apologize for that, but we're going to do one giveaway tonight, and to make it up, we'll do 3 giveaways next week. So next week will be the final week, and this gives us, I guess, 6 for our 5K, right, 6 giveaways for our 5K, so that'll all work out. So before we go any further, let's say hello to E4 Airman Tim D6, who's apparently in my hometown of Cleveland. Charles Latora, Paul O'Farrell, Rob Johnson, Fucko is in the house. John C. from the sunny Philippines. Dale Brady, Christopher Prest, Strelnikov, David Imperato, William Aarons, John Longshore, Charles Latora. I think we got Vince Ree, Hissy Cat Studio, Kevin Paulson, Daniel Silverthorne, Alan Salazar, Joe Faust from miserable Northeast Ohio, Lynn Pratt from Central Ohio, Abraxas MF, Bill Broadhurst, Jeff Beeler, John Clark, Matt Taylor, Peter Rushton, Mo Romaniuk, Iggy Krichtal, Justegard is in the house, who was lucky enough to have gone to the GMT weekend at the warehouse. No, my hair is clean. It's just I just got out of the shower not too long ago. Jeffrey Wesovich, hello from the Glory and Empire Test Labs. John Harden, and I think we got everybody. So I don't know what this number looks like right now. We're saying 81, so it's all good. I didn't put the social media stuff in every single place, so this time, because I was lazy. But it is all good. Opening music by the illustrious Mr. Dan Pancaldi himself. So what is up? I'm happy to report that War in the Desert has been completed. It was an Allied victory on the last turn on a 3-2 attack against Tunis. Allies needed a 5 or a 6 to take the hex, and they got a 6. And that was the game. And it was turned out on points to have been an Allied minor victory. So We're taking a week off, but next week we will be back at it, starting with Pacific War. So I've been looking forward to that for quite some time. The fantasy topic might have cut down the crowd, actually, because I don't know that necessarily people come here for that. You know what I'm saying? So is this, Jeff Beeler asked, is this topic connected to the excellent Space Wargame panel at Connections? It is not. However, I have been in on one of those panels in the past. I just couldn't really swing Connections given that it's during the week and my weeks are full. So hopefully folks who did attend the conventions, Connections conventions, enjoyed it and got some good stuff out of it. So we're starting to see, this has actually been floating around for a little bit, but we're starting to see, since it's been brought up like 2 or 3 times already in the chat, and we're like 6 minutes in, we're starting to see promotional stuff arise about Glory and Empire. So what that is it's a new battalion, if I'm not mistaken, level Napoleonic series from a longtime Labatt player who somehow got presumably burned out on Labatt. And it looks, the counters, I should say, look a lot like Labatt counters, which is to say that they're really attractive. It will be coming out from Lock and Load Publishing. I think there is a Kickstarter planned. I don't have any, I think I heard some guesstimates on when that's going to happen, but I don't remember it, and I don't want to propagate nonsense information. So yep, Jeffrey, that is my problem exactly. So fantasy war games. So SPI did several. So we had and somebody's going to ask, am I counting something like a War of the Ring, the current War of the Ring from Ares? Previously, I think it's the same game from Fantasy Flight. I mean, I'd certainly call it a war game, even though it's got little toy soldiers in it. But I don't know that it's necessarily in the space that I kind of am leaning into talking about tonight, which is, again, more of the stuff that was done by Avalon Hill and SPI and GDW and some other companies too, right? I mean, we would be remiss in skipping over Starfleet Battles, right, which came from Task Force Games and the Amarillo Design Bureau, who Amarillo Design Bureau is the current publishers of Starfleet Battles and Fed and Empire and all that stuff. And Metagaming did a bunch of stuff too. Starfleet Battles predates ASL by at least a decade. Now, I'm not sure if it's quite that long, but it's from quite a while. And there's some newer stuff. Michael Mellon, first of all, welcome back to the stream. Mentions that Escape from Hades, which I believe is a Herman Luttman and Fred Manzo design. It is available from Hollandspiel, and it's supposed to be pretty fun as well. So let me remind folks to, do like the video. Please do subscribe to the channel if you're not already subscribed. We don't get the cool notification now because I'm running through StreamYard. But wonder how we would do that. I don't know. Anyway, we were not going to get a notification if somebody subscribes right now, but I will get notified if somebody uses Super Chat. So if you want to, make sure I don't miss your fantastic question. I'm sure it was fantastic, but I got to see it in order to answer it. So Super Chats are a way to make sure that I will see it because it comes across in a big thing for the Super Chat. So Starship Troopers is another one. I never played Princess Ryan Star Marines, and I'm not particularly familiar with it. Ooh, what is this? Interesting. Infantry Brigades. It's the only one of those I've seen so far. So War of the Ring is... so when I'm talking, in this case, about War of the Ring, I mean the SPI War of the Ring, which was part of the Games of Middle-earth trilogy. Now, I didn't think much of the other two games, Gondor and Sauron, but then again, I didn't play either of those. So, I limited experience and all that jazz. Did I miss a corner? Yes, it looks like I did. And those were, who was, there was Richard Berg was one of the designers on that. And was it John Butterfield? Jason R. Lariviere is in the house. Welcome back, Jason. I'm not probably going to go see the Northman this weekend, but I might have something to say about that topically. Looking up Middle Earth here. I hate doing this while I'm streaming. Howard Barish, Richard Berg, Rob Mosca, and Linda Mosca are the four people credited as designers on BGG, and that's for the trilogy, not just for War of the Ring. So I think the War of the Ring itself was Howard Barish and Richard Berg. I'm doing that from memory. No, I do not have it behind me on the shelf anymore. So Freedom of the Galaxy is not Hex Encounter, but it's unabashedly a war game, and it is, to my eye, really neat. I haven't played it in decades, but I did pick it up again. Jeff Beeler mentions that the Dragoon Commander YouTube channel, that's Brant from the Armchair Dragoons. I don't know if it's just Brant necessarily. It's the Armchair Dragoons, but I think it's just Brant. A bunch of the Connections panels will be available on that channel, and I think more is probably coming there. I think he's probably trickling them out. John C., to be honest, I loathe Top Gun. I think it is not. I think it's cheesy and absolutely drenched in that sort of mid 80s Kenny Loggins bullshit music. So it's surprising that I am kind of interested in seeing the Infantry Battalion here, the sequel. I'm kind of more curious for everything else. I'm kind of more curious to see what they do with Val Kilmer's character, who may get like a picture on the wall type of cameo. For those who don't know, Val Kilmer's not getting any work right now because he had some kind of tracheal extraction and he talks through a robotic box now. So unfortunately he is, somebody that I enjoyed watching for a long time. One of my very favorite comedies, and I'm not a big comedy guy, go figure, was Real Genius, which of course, one of his early films, which is a great film. All right. So I picked Barbarossa Army Group North for a couple reasons tonight. One, it's big enough that I'm not going to friggin' finish it. I've had a bad run of, I'm clipping this game and I finish it like an hour into the show, and that's awkward. So we will not be finishing this tonight. There's a lot more counters in this version than there were previously because quite a few units, at least on the German side, which is all I've clipped so far, are represented by two counters, right? They're 4-step units. So unit takes a step loss, you flip it. Unit takes another step loss, you replace it with the appropriate replacement counter. That has the possibility, I got to look at the player aids on this, but that has the possibility of sucking some time out of play unless there's a card that allows you to organize those things. Sword Lords of the Eastern Kingdoms. God, I don't even remember. The title sounds vaguely familiar. Dave 1013, first of all, welcome back, Dave, mentions Amoeba Wars, which is a kind of an interesting title. I want to say that Avalon Hill acquired, I'm not going to look it up. I want to say that Avalon Hill acquired that from somebody else, possibly Battleline. I got it out with somebody on Twitter about Kenny Loggins not too long ago. I just loathe Kenny Loggins. Fucko asks if we're missing Stigler tonight. Christopher Prest says he is at the Decision Games Expo. You're a cruel man, Mr. Prest. Tom MC thinks it was the designer of Fantasy Flight's War of the Ring that did Age of Conan for Fantasy Flight. Similar activation time mechanic. I did not really look at that game, even though I'm actually a fairly big Conan fan, going back to the 80s, I guess. Although I gotta be honest. Well, we can talk about this because actually SPI at one point was lining up to do a Conan game. And boy, it would have been very interesting to see that. And I want to say I don't know if they got as far as actually writing up a license, but I want to say that Mark Herman says there was a draft, and Mark Herman was, I guess, working on it. I'm not sure as the designer or developer or what, but he says there was a draft, and I'm not gonna question Mark on that. It would be very interesting to see, and one wonders if there was a license. SPI was known, and they did this more than a few times, was known for floating an idea before they approached the owner of the IP. So who did Herman's John Carter? I'm not sure I understand the question. Mark Herman did Mark Herman's John Carter. And I had that briefly in the 90s, and man, I should have kept that. If nothing else, it's got a fantastic cover. Bayonet Brant, welcome back to the stream. We have already directed people to the Connections material, for one thing. I have not played Columbia's Wizard Kings. However, I have played their Victory, which is the system that Wizard Kings is based on. And I kind of liked the system. I just didn't like that it was kind of like, at the time, they've changed it since then. At the time, it was kind of like this generic World War II thing, and I didn't really like it. Oh, okay. So we're asking what the publisher was of Mark Herman's John Carter game. Yeah, that was SPI. And I wonder if SPI got a license from the Robert E. Howard estate, and that license passed to TSR in the acquisition, and thereby that's how TSR did their fairly terrible Conan game, which was an RPG, like an RPG, not a board game at all. I'm not sure if Mark had anything else in the era that slipped through the cracks, but it was pretty much SPI and thence to Victory Games, and thence to a variety of other publishers in the post-Victory Games era. Doug Sunset mentions Diadem from FGU. I remember I could picture that. I never owned that and never seriously looked at it. I can, as is often the case, I can picture in the box in my head. Doug also mentions Sky Galleons of Mars, which is very interesting. We almost played that at Winterfest this past year. We just didn't quite get the time to do it. The guy who might have runs it at Origins. I don't think he's going to do it this year. It was Don Mates, yes, that did the cover of that. It's great cover too. There's a lot of really great John Carter cover art. Speaking of not exactly this, but what's the guy's name? Damn it, John Bama. I might be having Bama is the artist's last name. Was the fellow who did the art for the Doc Savage reprints that started in the 60s and ran through to at least to the 80s. Just passed away. If I had to guess, I would have assumed that fellow was long dead. But apparently he just passed away like in the last couple of days. William Byrd, new title from Flying Pig to Long Road, qualified World War III with vampires and werewolves. Sure, I guess. I don't really know much about that. I've got weird and really kind of narrow tastes in sci-fi and fantasy in general, and specifically for board games. Doug Sun says Space 1889 was a victim of the industry insider effect. Everyone in the industry thought it was a brilliant concept and created for pre-copies, and the general public was kind of meh. I do think it was a few years ahead of its time as well, to be fair. Because it really is. I mean, it was too early to really capitalize on the whole steampunk thing, which, if it did come along later, it might have been able to. Strelnikov, struggle for the Galactic Empire. Don't have it on the shelf behind me, but yes, I've actually played it. and I actually like it quite a bit. That was unfortunate. It is a solitaire game from Joe Miranda, and it is kind of what it sounds like. Now, they have a couple other products because it's Decision, and what is Decision Games if it is not marketing confusion? There's another branded product that is Galactic Empire something that's a different game. I'm talking about Struggle for the Galactic Empire, the Joe Miranda game, which is like a map of the whole galaxy. And it's a very sort of Asimovian scenario in which there's a galactic empire and it's going to shit. And you're in charge and you have to forestall it going to shit as best you can. And it is actually, I think, pretty cool and does kind of do what it says on the tins. You're in charge of the Galactic Empire and it's going to shit. It's much better than the execrable Foundation TV show. Somebody mentioned, and I missed it, the Mongoose Conan game, and I actually have some product for that and actually do think it's decent. However, I also like the new Conan game from Modifius. It's from Modifius and uses their 2D20 system. Now, of course, one of my sort of formative, and we've also mentioned a couple of things out of Chaosium too, Dragon Pass, Red Bear and White Moon, and Nomad Gods, which I've never even seen a copy of Nomad Gods, I don't think. I maybe in pictures. Dragon Pass, I'd kind of like to acquire, to be honest about it. But I'm not buying stuff right now, right? That's part of the reason why I didn't ship this weekend, because I spent all the money at the vet instead. So we will be clear to get that stuff taken care of this coming weekend. And of course, GDW did a bunch of stuff, and those are trickling into the chat now. Stellar Conquest. Speaking of which, I really liked Stellar Conquest. The folks I was playing with generally did not, and I had to bully them into playing it because for them it felt like keeping track of the bowling score. There's a fair amount of paperwork in Stellar Conquest, and people generally didn't like that. I didn't hate it. I don't mind that particularly. Dave 1013, yeah, that's the same. That is the same game as the Chaosium Dragon Pass. Now, SPI, of course, did the Star Force trilogy, which was Star Force, which is in some packagings called Star Force Alpha Centauri, Star Soldier, and Outreach. And they were all kind of set in this sort of loose setting that had actually originally been devised for Star Force by Redmond Simonson. Trying to keep track of these things here. And Star Force is more interesting than it is fun to play. I think it is interesting. I think it's a real exploration of real science fictional ideas in a wargame format. It's kind of a drag to play. Star Soldier, I didn't think was... I never honestly played Star Soldier. I did not think it was as interesting as Starship Troopers, the Avalon Hill Starship Troopers. And of course, obviously, it's covering some of the same space, right? Now, on the other hand, Outreach, I played several times, enjoyed it tremendously. There is, again, some paperwork, which one, doesn't normally associate with fun. At least a lot of people don't, but again, doesn't bother me. And it's a game that really isn't like anything else. It's it's hard to explain. So that little coughing thing kind of went away. And then I figured out that it went away because I've been taking the wrong pills for the last several days. So that's kind of unfortunate. Star Force was simultaneous pre-plotted movement. So, and it's it's kind of like a ship on ship thing. It's like here's a ship and the other guy has a ship, and you're doing this plotted movement thing to resolve the combat. And it's just not, again, it's interesting. And the pretty accurate, I gotta say, 3D map of near stars is, kind of worth the price of the box, to be honest. but it wasn't particularly fun to play. Captain Asparagus mentions Space Empires 4X, and that is an example of a much more recent product that I do like a lot. And I can't wait till the last expansion comes out. This isn't... No, I was thinking this was all of the Germans, and it is absolutely not. Space Corp. That's not a war game. I don't think John Butterfield has called it a war game. It is a straight Euro, straight card assisted Euro. I have played it, and it's pretty good. But I do like, as Rob Johnson is now inserted into the conversation, if somebody didn't mention it before, Terraforming Mars is also not a war game in any... I mean, there's literally no fighting in it. And there's really no fighting in Space Corp either, to be honest about it. So, but Star Force, but Space Empires 4X I like a lot, and it is exactly what it says. It is, damn it, it is a Space at 4X game with all 4 X's, which, for example, Twilight Imperium doesn't really have. Twilight Imperium really doesn't have real exploration in it. At least it didn't in the last edition. Maybe they've added some things like that. Avalon Hill's Dune, not a war game. Nobody thinks that's a war game. Great game, by the way. It's totally worth your time. There is now... So here's the biggest problem with Stellar Horizons, and I like Stellar Horizons a lot. It is a sort of semi-space space program building game, and I'm all about that, right? However, its footprint is really pretty big for the kind of game that it is, right? And this is going to sound weird, but the kind of people, the people that I play Case Blue with are not into Stellar Horizons, and I can't bring it over that guy's house and set it up as basement and leave it there for a month while we play it. So the people that like it are the people who play shorter, maybe lighter, maybe not games, and it's hard to get that to happen. It is also, I think, works great solitaire, to be honest about it, but it is also a terrific multiplayer game, but it takes like 20 hours to play it, and it's very space hungry. However, where all this was going is that there's a vassal module for it now. So if you have problems making that happen because of space and or time, then the vassal module is now an option. William Aarons, thank you so much for the super chat. Which space exploration game has the best outer space map, either of the solar system or of deep space? So somebody's probably going to say High Frontier, and I'm not. I think the High Frontier map is very diagrammy, and that might not sound negative, but it's so diagrammy that it is aesthetic. I find it aesthetically displeasing. The one I'm going to point out is Star Force, because it's got like an accurate, and it's 3D movement too, right? You've got like a chart you can look up the Y coordinates on, or Z coordinates, or whatever it is, on there. And it's for the time, it came out in like 1977 or something like that. Now there's RPGs with like the 2300 AD star map was also really good for its day. And actually one of the editions of Space Master had a star map too, but I don't think it was as accurate, and it definitely wasn't as attractive. Freedom of the Galaxy map is a sort of a point-to-point galaxy map, where each point has like sub points of like, okay, so you're in this star system and you have 3 planets there, and each of the planets is a ring around the star, and then each of the rings has like spaces on the ring to represent the different environments on the planet. It's pretty neat. To be cornered into answering William's question, I'm going with Star Force. Not necessarily because it's the prettiest by modern standards. I think it pretty obviously isn't. But it's really neat that it was an accurate map of all the stars near the sun, near the solar system back, as known in like 1970, whatever. So that was actually pretty cool. I also have played Star Frontiers. I actually have never played Star Frontiers. I have played High Frontier. Now, not the new edition, the previous edition. And I considered it more trouble than it was worth, to be blunt. I think what we will probably accomplish here today is to get all of the Germans clipped. Is what I think is going to happen. Don't believe we'll be doing the getting to the Soviets. I remember that EVE Online board game. And I've played EVE Online, the video game. And in fact, during the height of the pandemic, where literally nobody left their house, I was actually playing EVE Online, and I put probably 200 hours into it. Dave 1013 for Merchant of Venus. No, I'd say not. But I've never played that. I owned it at one point, but I mean, I don't think there's no combat in it. Mike Anthony mentions SPI's Universe, and was that okay? So there were three. I'm trying to think if I'm misstating or misremembering this, but I want to say there were 3 RPGs that were done by SPI. Universe, their sci-fi game, which I think I might be conflating the two, but I think Universe was John Butterfield, and Dragon Quest, which is quite a good game actually, was Jerry Klug. And the third, of course, is the somewhat infamous Dallas TV show role-playing game. Now, I will say that Sword and Sorcery had some RPG elements into it as well, but I honestly kind of feel like that may have been one of those things that felt weird at the time, because it was like an attempt to do an RPG that was done by somebody that didn't really understand an RPG. Captain Asparagus, is that an actual quote from me? It may have been. It sounds like something I would say. I had an article on the blog years and years ago about, like you hear, a boil down of EVE Online, and it kind of made a lot of waves at the time. Red Dust Rebellion from GMT. That's the sci-fi coin game. I haven't pre-ordered that, but of all the coin games that are up for pre-order on P500 right now, that is the one I'm most likely to buy. It is a great opportunity to actually tailor the scenario and world of the game to the coin mechanisms. And I want to see how well that works. I'm very curious to see that. Tom MC, I just haven't gotten to it yet. Imperium is one of the several sci-fi war games produced by Game Designers Workshop. They did a bunch actually, and even the ones like Belter that are there's combat in Belter, but I mean even the ones that aren't that wargamey are still kind of wargamey, right? I have owned all of them at one point except for, and so these are the ones I'm not going to talk about: Blood Tree Rebellion and Asteroid. Now, Asteroid is one of those things that so some of these were formerly Traveler tie-ins, and some of them were not. Some of them were just like independent things. Like Double Star was not a Traveler tie-in, whereas something like Imperium, obviously, the whole Traveler universe grew out of Imperium, right? GDW had this weird idea that people really wanted like wargame treatments of the personal combat system. They did at least 2 or 3 different versions of that, not counting Striker, the miniatures rules. Mander says he would like to see updated modern Traveler-linked board games, ground or space combat. So check out Attack Vector Tactical. Okay, I may be mispresenting this product, but the same folks that do Attack Vector Tactical do, which is, I think, a relatively hardcore space flight sim type game. They also do I believe, somewhat simpler Traveler Starship Combat board/miniatures game. So that's worth checking out. That's for some reason, that's Ken Burnside's group. I forget the name of the company for some reason. Somebody will mention it. Dark Nebula is basically Imperium with a modular map. So it's basically the same game, except that you, instead of one like map that's the map, you got these 6 geomorphic panels you can put together however you like. Brant, yes, I am thinking of Squadron Strike. Ajanti High Lightning was another one of those, man-to-man combat on a spaceship, or man-to-man combat on an asteroid station, or man-to-man combat on, a scout courier. GDW did several of those, some of which were like Mayday and Snapshot were pretty obviously intended to be like a board game / war game treatment of the Traveler combat system if you wanted to play it that way. And I think, based on no real evidence, that's probably how they got used the most. But they also did Asteroid, which was also man-to-man combat on an asteroid base. They did Ajanti High Lightning, which was man-to-man combat on a giant cruiser, with complete deck plans of the cruiser, by the way, which is one of the reasons why that's considered highly collectible now. The other is Supplement 5, which you could actually only ever get in Ajanti High Lightning, and it gave you the full details on the Ajanti High Lightning, or the Lightning class cruisers. Snapshot's pretty simple. Ajanti High Lightning was a little more detailed. Ad Astra Games, thank you. That is Ken's group. And they do a lot. They did a demo. Did they do a demo at Connections, Brant? I thought they do a lot of online demos. I can tell you that. And of course, you can, if you are of a mind to be Star Trek oriented, and you don't mind relatively heavy rules, you can look into Amarillo Design Bureau's stuff. So you got Starfleet Battles, which is what it sounds like. It's Enterprise style, versus Klingon D7 battlecruiser style combats. Generally, it's kind of single ship or small squadron is kind of where you want to be. It's kind of the sweet spot there. If you are, one player, you want to run a ship or 2, maybe 3 at the most. Otherwise, it becomes way too much. So in that context, it is kind of, without being particularly mechanically similar, it's kind of the wooden ships and iron men of spaceships, which is very much, in line with Star Trek. Now, there's an interesting story behind the licensing there. It is an officially licensed Star Trek product, but it is the kind of license that nobody gets anymore. It was actually licensed. So Paramount licensed Franz Joseph Designs in the, I think, late 60s or early 70s to do the Starfleet Technical Manual, which I might even still have. It's a pretty neat book from when I was a kid, right? And then the part that never happens anymore is that that license allowed them to have sub-licensees, and they sub-licensed it out to what it ended up being Task Force Games, or whatever the legal entity was at the time. And they did Starfleet Battles. So they can only use the stuff from the original series and the animated series. And therefore, it's kind of diverged, and they're not allowed to mention any of the official characters. So, and they've been very cautious about not doing anything that might cause, then Paramount, now CBS's, now Paramount again's legal department to come and climb 2 feet up their asses, and take everything away. So they've kind of carved it out as the Starfleet universe instead. So you still have the Federation, you still have Klingons and Romulans, all the ships that you know and love from the original series or the animated series pop up, and they look like you would expect them to. And If you want like the full Starfleet Battles experience, you play Starfleet Battles. If you want a somewhat lighter experience, maybe you'll play Federation Commander, which is sort of the lighter version of Starfleet Battles. And if you want the strategic level game, you can play Federation Empire. There was a precursor to Federation Empire that was called, I think, Federation Space. But I have no experience with that. I do have a copy of the Kzinti were from the animated series. There was an episode of the Star Trek the animated series, which I remember watching as a kid, by the way. Black Panzer, first of all, welcome to the stream. And we have already talked about Struggle for the Galactic Empire. I think it's actually a pretty cool game. So Larry Niven, the author of the Known Space books, wrote an episode of Star Trek the Animated Series called The Slaver Weapon, which does not play quite like his original story, but it does have the Kzinti, and they are, after it's the Slaver Weapon. And I'm happy to be corrected about this, but until like last year, in an episode of Picard, the Kzinti had never again been so much as mentioned. The Gorns and the Tholians, the Tholians actually showed up in Enterprise. I don't remember. I remember the Gorns being mentioned, but never actually appeared. But in the episode, I don't want to ruin Picard for you to any greater extent than it is already being ruined, but they're mentioned in one of the episodes of the first season of Picard. So Brant says that the light version of Starfleet Battles is actual space flight. Yeah, they really did milk the absolute pants off of that. I think the Hydrons and the Lyrans are original to the Starfleet universe. The Lyrans are just an offshoot of the Kzinti, and the Hydrons are kind of like the dudes from Lensman, the way I picture them anyway. FASA and their Renegade Legion series. So he had a huge hit that continues to be popular to this day in BattleTech. Remember that FASA originally started as a company doing third-party material for Traveler. But they kind of hit it big with BattleTech, and they kind of tried to make Lightning Strike twice with the Renegade Legion line, but it did not take off to the same extent. But they did a couple interesting things. So they did like a ground combat game and a space fighter combat game and a space capital ship combat game and a planetary assault combat game. And it's really kind of a fairly complete experience. I don't know if it's any good, but because I never played any of them. I had one or two at one point, but I never had them all. Tom MC mentions the FASA Star Trek RPG, and he liked it. I have a bit mixed feelings on it. On the one hand, it had some really legitimately great ideas in it. The starship combat in it is absolutely brilliant. On the other hand, I do feel like it had this sort of weird and very sort of bloated, heavy feeling percentile system, which their Doctor Who RPG, which I also had, shared. And I'm not sure it quite worked. I do still have I'm going to pretend that you didn't mention the name of that, Jeff. So, because I have never played it. I will never play it. I just don't care. It's very popular. SFB doesn't really need spreadsheets, but Federation and Empire, you really kind of want a spreadsheet, to be honest, just to manage all that paperwork. There's not the paperwork in Starfleet Battles is really kind of more just notation than anything else. Is this rail artillery? It totally is. John Longshore, thank you for stopping by. Let's hope the Russian porn bots don't show up now. DVG's War of the Worlds. Hadn't thought of that. I'm prepared to preliminarily assume that it's a wargamey type game. Starfire. So there's been like at least 3 different editions of the campaign rules for Starfire. The one I have is called Imperial Starfire, and yes, it absolutely needs spreadsheets. I'm not that Mike Anthony. I'm not offended by that, so it's all good. I'm not that curmudgeonly about what is a war game. I mean, I'll tell you my opinion, but I'll also tell you I'm just some random person on the internet, so don't necessarily take it from me. I mean, I have no problems considering things like Risk and Twilight Struggle to be war games. So I think my personal definition of that category is on the broader side. It's broader than some folks you see. I certainly have no problems considering, say, Pavlov's House or Undaunted to be war games. No problems at all. Something like Amoeba Wars, maybe not. Ultra Starfire. God, I don't have Cricktal. Thank you, but man, I don't have the friggin' time. That's my problem. So Jeff Beeler mentions that Starfire was the model for Honor Harrington. Yes, and in fact, a bunch of the universe fiction for Starfire was actually written by David Weber, and it's like shockingly good material. Agray Day says Stellaris is the Academy game space game. I'm not sure if it's the same game that was being talked about before. That's still in development, I think, or I'm not sure where they are with it, to be honest. Brant, yeah, that's a fair point. So Iggy says he doesn't have time either. Totally understand. Yeah, that's my problem. Is I'm trying not to say no to too much stuff, but I'm having to say no to a lot of stuff. Does Invasion America by SPI classify as fantasy? Oh, you're on dangerous ground with Brant here. Brant says that's a historical game. So Eclipse is a war game. Now I've never played Eclipse. I'd actually like to try Eclipse, particularly the new edition, but the new edition costs like $300, and I'm not buying that. So I do think Eclipse is more of a 4X game than Twilight Imperium. Now, I love Twilight Imperium, but it's another one of those Stellar. It's got that same problem that I talked about with Stellar Horizons. Is that like the people that I could play a huge game with aren't the kind of people who want to play something like Stellar Horizons. So I don't get to play it very often because it's kind of a huge project. Rob Johnson, there was a Hammer Slammers board game from Mayfair back in the day. Star Wars Monopoly God. So back in the whenever this was, this was like the early 2000s now, I guess. When the Lord of the Rings movies were still an ongoing concern, my relatives, who normally do not understand my taste in games at all, or games in general, picked me up for Christmas the Lord of the Rings movie version Monopoly and Lord of the Rings movie version Risk. And the Risk is surprisingly fun. I surprisingly had fun with it. The Lord of the Rings Monopoly was a complete turd. But I mean, it's Monopoly. It's kind of bad out of the box. So Captain Asparagus, the Stellaris Overlord expansion. I actually played some Stellaris a few weeks ago now. I probably played a total of about 2 hours over the course of several nights because that's the kind of playtime I have available. Lords of the Middle Sea. I have never played that. Tony Mammal says Monopoly is a turd no matter how it's skinned. Yes, that is exactly what we found. So Mike Anthony says I can get the new Eclipse from Finland. Okay. Oy vey. I will tell you that the Hammer Slammers game was for the one from Mayfair was in a very handsome. I mean, it was a 1.5 or 1 inch, I think, Mayfair box. Box was not a nice box, but it did have the really great, hover tank cover art from the book on the cover of the the box, and it's a cool and striking piece of art. After the Holocaust, never played that. Never played Invasion of America either. I'm just not super duper into that as a topic, I think is what it boils down to. Star Trek Ascendancy. Is that the sort of Space 4X Star Trek game? No, that was the one I'm thinking of is Birth of the Federation. There's also a Space 4X video game called Ascendancy that I actually played the pants off of back when it was, new. Agray Day says, what was the first science fiction war game published? Boy, that's a good question. It wouldn't surprise me if it was something that Luzaki did, actually. He did a number of early Luzaki products, at least one of which was a kind of Star Trek thing. One of those, I'm not sure what the dates are on those, so that's kind of my issue with that. All right, let's see what we can do with this here. So I've got regiments, engineers. So we're going to go with that. I'm not sure how we're going to do markers in this. There's a lot less markers in this edition of the game than there is in the other one. I've already started working on the tray labels for this too, and I haven't labeled an Aegis counter tray yet, but I'm guessing it will present no problems. So I was thinking we are clipping Army Group Barbarossa Army Group Center from GMT. Came out in, I think I got it in February. That's the thing with all the Starfleet battles races all kind of have clever combat mechanics. It's kind of SFB's thing is to give every race their own unique and interesting combat mechanics. All right, so I think we're going to put all the supply in one container. Put all the miscellaneous artillery in another container. Cavalry, regiments. Put that there. So I did manage to catch up on. Oh, that good call, Doug, on that. Triplanetary is 73. Yeah. Who was the original designer of that? Well, it was Game Designers Workshop. I almost have to say it was either Frank Chadwick or this says John Harshman and Mark Miller. But the credits on BGG don't always reflect credits in the actual game. So take that with a bit of a grain of salt. All right. We are, other than aircraft, we're basically done with the Germans here. Princess Ryan Space Marines. We mentioned that earlier. I didn't play that. So Bill Fawcett's The Company War. That was another Mayfair product, as I recall. I've never read the books, but I've had them highly recommended to me more than once. So I would actually rather like to try that at some point. Joe Faust mentions the Starship Troopers miniatures game. I want to say that was from Mongoose, wasn't it? Captain Asparagus. So on the Expanse. Okay, so first of all, highly recommended by me. There's a game called the Expanse board game, which is from Jeff Engelstein. And I've seen it described as coin-like, and I think coin-like is probably, there's video of it on YouTube. I think coin-like is probably accurate. Going so far as to call it a coin game is misleading, because it's not quite that. It's not quite that coin-like. There's also an Expanse RPG from Green Ronin, and I've heard very good things about the RPG, more so than I've heard about the board game, but I haven't played either one, so don't take my word for it. Form your own opinion. Manders mentions, and this has been mentioned already, up thread, somebody else mentioned TSR's Greyhawk Wars, which, so actually that's actually a good point. So Greyhawk Wars is one of sort of 3 products released in the 80s or 90s that sort of try to bring wargaming back into D&D. And not miniatures wargaming, but hex encounter wargaming. And Greyhawk Wars was one of those. Now, the map was not a hex map. It was an area map, as I recall. It's been a long time. And it kind of cocked up the Greyhawk setting for those people who are like really attached to the Greyhawk setting. And there's reasons to like Greyhawk as a setting, but I think that's beyond the scope of what we're talking about here on this show tonight. The others were Dragons of War for the Dragonlance series and Red Arrow Black Shield in the Expert series of modules. And both of those products were like, standard TSR, adventure module in a folio type of thing. But they also were like included full war games, right? With hex maps. And I want to say the Dragonlance one had a hex map. I know Red Arrow Black Shield did. And in fact, the known world maps were also hex maps. So, Grant mentions we're also mentions Red Arrow Black Shield, but Dragons of War was very similar. Would be interesting to run those down. There has been a new edition of Divine Right relatively recently, but it is already gone. Solo Wargaming Show, first of all, welcome back to the stream, also mentions Battle System. But Battle System is really a miniature system. And I realized that it did come, and I know this because I had it, it did come with actually a lot of counters for different kinds of troops. But it, you're clearly using those as stand-ins for the miniatures. And as I recall, it came with like 2 miniatures or 1 miniature or something like that, or, not enough miniatures to play it with. And again, at some point we may do a show about miniatures, but if we do, then I will invite somebody to help with the show that knows something more about miniatures than I do. Mike Anthony mentions that 25th anniversary Divine Right. I believe that's the reprint that I was thinking of. Tom MC says there's a Birthright PC adaptation. So I think Birthright is a really good setting on its own. Plus that kind of domain level play. I mean, as a wargamer, that I find that super appealing. And I'm not the only one, right? There was actually a big run in the RPG space. There was actually a big run on like what we would call domain level play, which is basically that the player characters are lords or ladies or whatever, right? They run either kingdoms or holdings or something like that. They are people of note, and they can order other people around and have resources. And there's been a lot of different ways to tackle that. I know that Matt Colville, for anybody who watches Matt's channel, has been a big proponent of that, and he actually designed a product like that for D&D 3, or I forget whether it was 3 or 3.5, but it was called Fields of Blood. It was from Eden Studios, and it's a pretty good book, but it's kind of really rigidly tied to its scale, and the scale is such that it is hard to run it in a setting that's not explicitly designed to be run using Fields of Blood. Matt has talked about Birthright a couple of times. And we ran a 1.5 Birthright campaign back in the day, and we had a lot of fun with it. I was the guy, the court wizard. It was just fantastically fun. And aside from that, I felt like it was a good, well-designed setting. on its own, right? Even if you didn't want to use the whole lords and ladies angle, I think you could still get a cool campaign out of it. It did have quite abstract mass combat mechanics, and in fact, it was kind of a card game where you had you had this sort of map grid that was like a full-size map sheet, and you actually moved these cards around on the map sheet as your units. And it was pretty neat. And each of like the expansion boxes had like gave you more, unit cards to play out that mass combat with. So yeah, Doug, I feel exactly the same way about Matt, who is an old acquaintance from the RPG Net days. And he's got a ton of really good content on his channel about how to do RPGs. And a lot of it is not really relevant to the kind of RPGs I personally would prefer to play. Some of it is, a good amount of it is, but a lot of it's not. Like his new monster book, for example, has a lot of like really gonzo shit in it that is not going to be a tonal fit for any kind of D&D like fantasy game that I would ever choose to play. So, but then again, I think he's had a lot of good advice as well. So VGG says that the first sci-fi war game is Lensman. Is that Phil Pritchard's Lensman? That's got to be based on the Doc Smith Lensman stories, I would assume. Well, Jason W., they're bringing Dragonlance back, so maybe they'll do that this time. Gotta say, I'm not incredibly excited about that personally. I kind of feel like Dragonlance was not a strong enough setting to support just whatever kind of RPG campaign you wanted to run in it. Now, not to say that a game master can't transcend that limitation. That's absolutely possible. But you really did feel like, after that initial series of Dragonlance modules and the books, which are not as closely tied to the modules as some people think, that was kind of the story that the setting was intended to tell, and it told it. And I think it was really revelatory to a lot of people at the time. Now I think that approach shows a lot of limitations, but I first read the Lensman books in the 90s, and they are astonishingly dated in so many ways, but they're still a lot of fun. And structurally, they are actually really clever and well plotted, I will also say. Now, I'm hoping he's not going to make the 2 million. I was hoping that he was going to get the 2 million on the latest Kickstarter so that we could see Campaign for North Africa on his channel. That would be something. Every once in a while, there'll be talk about turning Lensman into like a movie or something, and every time I see that kind of news, I say to myself, yeah, I don't think that's going to happen. I think I don't think it would adapt well to modern sensibilities. Let me put it that way. The Tim D6 asked if anyone played the TSR Buck Rogers games. No. Jeff Beeler had fun playing Knights of Camelot. Right into the page of legend, this role-playing board game of Valiant Knights. Interesting. The only reason they did it was because Lorraine Williams was the sister or niece or daughter of Flint Dill, who owned the Buck Rogers IP. Didn't create anything, not a thing, but he owned the Buck Rogers IP. Yeah, he's not going to make the 2 million. Yeah. Doug says that Matt has said good things about Talisman. So I haven't played Talisman in a long time, and there's been at least 3 versions of Talisman since I have played Talisman. So it is possible that, like Axis and Allies, that my concerns and criticisms about Talisman have been alleviated by more recent versions of the game than I have played. However, Talisman is 30 to 60 minutes of really fun game in a 6-hour game. and it absolutely just becomes an unfun slog. And you know, again, I'm willing to be convinced of. Well, I guess I'm not willing to be convinced, because if somebody came to me today and said, "Hey, would you like to play this?" I'd probably say, "Nah, I'm good. I'm good." Actual quote, yes, I've heard that quote. I don't know if it's apocryphal, but on the other hand, I think that that quote is in character for James Ward. So, who's quite a charming guy, I got to tell you. I've met him. Yeah, they announced. I don't know exactly what the new Dragonlance product is. That's kind of what I was like. Look, I watched the trailer, and then I'm like, you know, I don't know. Yeah, they're bringing Dragonlance back, okay, but I don't know what they're like what the actual product is. Old Lady Plays, thanks for stopping by. What I kind of think I would like to see them do is like do a Dragonlance remastered and go at the original. Go back to the original modules and retell that story as like a modern adventure path with modern ideas, and I think you could really do something interesting with that. Doug says he was at the Gamma show and in that presentation. As I said, that quote is in character for James Ward. Now, like I said, if they went back, like I said, with Dragonlance, I feel like I've seen the story already. Now, if they want to like go back and make tweaks and, you know, give it a really good fancy presentation and all that, and maybe do a big fancy world book, I would very much like to. I don't know if I'd buy it, but I'd be really curious to see such a product. I'd be curious to see how well they did with that kind of thing. To retell the original story, maybe update some using modern adventure building techniques and stuff like that, update it to the current system. I don't know, and I don't have the sense that that's what they'll do. I think it's not. Yeah, Captain Asparagus, we actually talked about that. She didn't own it, but Flint Dill did. And maybe it was a family trust. In fact, it was the Dill family trust. So, all right. So I think I want to get these couple of loose counters that I got. And they're bringing Spelljammer back too. I gotta say, which I'm also not super excited about. I found Spelljammer to be kind of laughable back in the day. As I said, though, I'm kind of a genre purist. Old Lady Plays. See, that's my experience was the Gil Gerard series. Back, that's kind of my experience of Buck Rogers too. So, but voiced by Mel Blanc too, by the way. So there was I forget who wrote the blog post, but somebody wrote a blog post that says, "Hey, I'm not excited about Spelljammer. Here's why: because it really was kind of lame, and it really kind of was. It's not the genre. Now, I'm not into the genre mashup thing either, and that's kind of part of it for me. But all of the actual specific things that this person said about it, which is that, you know, it wasn't integrated at all into any of the sort of existing settings that it was supposed to tie together. That's all true. It had huge tonal issues where on the one hand, it would be this sort of completely silly thing where the gnomes are like literally hunting down flying space hamsters or some shit like that. And on the other hand, you would have this, the topic of this adventure is genocide. It's like, oh, really? And, you know, tonally, it's hard to make stuff that varied work without causing problems in your setting. And it did. Starfinder is the best version of Spelljammer. Is that, well, so On the other hand, okay, now I didn't like Spelljammer. I guess it was inevitable that we were going to end up talking about some RPG stuff here on this topic, but it wasn't really my plan. On the one hand, I didn't like Spelljammer, and on the and I'm probably not going to like whatever new Spelljammer product they're working on either. But on the other hand, I think it's the only reasonable way to do space D&D is to make it space D&D. And if you are going to embrace space D&D, embrace space D&D. And in that sense, Spelljammer's really the only. I think there have been some fairly minor third-party products in the D20 space that have touched on it as well, but nothing that really made a huge impact that I recall. I seem to recall back in that D20 boom, I think somebody did some space D&D stuff. On the other hand, for people that just want to say, oh, let's make D&D except make it a horror game, or D&D and make it a sci-fi game, or D&D and make it a superhero game, I don't see the appeal in that. I don't think that system is robust enough to handle those other things. I think it's barely competent at handling D&D. So Star Frontiers, at least, and things like Alternity at least made an effort to kind of break out. Old Lady Plays, we have not mentioned Delta V specifically, but we have mentioned Universe, which Delta V was designed to tack into. Star Warriors. Captain Asparagus, that's absolutely right. I totally watched that show, To Ogle Aaron Gray in the spandex, whatever that was. And Michael Ansara was in there too, by the way. Jeff Beeler says, an RPG based on Warren Ellis's Ignition City. I don't know what that is. I was a sort of a follower of Ellis, but then I kind of got out of comics, and like the last comic that I kept buying only because he kept delaying it, like the last several issues, was the Planetary, not the Authority, but Planetary. The Authority got handed off to other creative people. Yes, Delta V is the same game as the tactical module in. Oh wait, as in Battlefleet Mars. I didn't know that. Delta V was released as a magazine game in Ares, I believe, and it also came with the deluxe edition, or whatever they called it, the box version of Universe. So actually, I think I have 2 copies of it, actually. Ellis did some, I forget the details, but I think there was some kind of douche business that Ellis got himself tied up into. But I'm sure it was just inevitable for him to come back. Christopher Press, did anyone ever play space opera? So I presume we're talking about the the FGU space opera, and no, I never played that. Nor did I ever play Other Suns, which had some of its background material is actually pretty interesting. There was back in the day. So after TSR eats SPI and decides they're going to continue SPI as its own thing, and they continue Ares magazine for a few issues, maybe 3 to 6 issues, and then they fold it into Dragon magazine as the Ares sci-fi section, which did not really produce a lot of good material. But I'm saying that, and it's what I'm really trying to say is they didn't do enough Traveler material. But what they did do was the moon. They did like a series of articles on the moon in various sci-fi RPGs. Okay, and there was a Traveler one written by Mark Miller, which was nice but not incredibly interesting. Brant, thanks for stopping by. The really cool one was the one for Other Suns. I would encourage people to run that article down. I don't know what issue it's in, but run that article down and read it. It's a great article. And then I picked up Other Suns a couple of years later, and I'm like, what the fuck is this? It's this like space furries RPG. It's an anthropomorphic animals space RPG. And it's just like, this is weird. I don't know. They did this cool background, and I thought I was going to get cool background, and this ain't it. So Then again, I haven't read that article in a while either, so maybe that was it was not as good as I remember. Paranoia. There is a Paranoia computer game coming, which I have listed on Steam. So FGU is nominally still exists as a trick to retain the rights to the IPs. Long story, but you can Google that if you want. Yes. Egg Ray Day, it's absolutely. So Paranoia is like this satirical sci-fi dystopian future game where Picture Logan's run, and it's run by, but it's kind of played for laughs, right? The computer is not only, evil, but insane and does all kinds of random stuff. Viteus brings up Kevin Symbieta. Not 100% clear that I've pronounced his name correctly there, but that's the guy who runs Palladium Books. I'm not really sure he can write a good setting, actually, but certainly he has a lot of cool ideas. I'll absolutely cop to that. Very few of those ideas really found full purchase in any of those material, I think. The Expanse computer game, that is that's one of those shit. There's a genre that falls into with Drummer as the main character, and actually it's pretty cool. And Drummer's awesome, so. Old Lady Plays mentions Ogre and Jev. That was, or Gev, or GEV, or however you want to say that. I never played that. I have played Ogre, and it's pretty good. Viteus, we are on the same page with that. The Morrow Project. So the Morrow Project was, another one of these RPG type, post-Holocaust type things. All right, we're going to do a giveaway. So let's see. Where the hell is the thing with the thing? Oh, piss. I probably got rid of it for the sake of pulling up. All right, so here's what we're going to do. We're going to see how this works. And I'm going to share. I'm going to share my screen here. All right, so we're going to use the StreamYard giveaway tool. So what you're going to do is you can start right now. Go ahead and start entering if you want to be in the drawing, and I'll show you what we're drawing for. It's very heavy. It's very heavy. We'll get a little bit bigger here for now. Level 7 Invasion. This is from Privateer Press, which is the people that do the Iron Kingdom stuff. It actually looks kind of cool. It's like a semi-cooperative. It's in the shrink wrap. It's brand new. I want it. It's not going to be my thing. I ain't got space for it, so we're giving it away. It actually looks kind of like a co-op Risk with aliens that invade, and you got to fight off the aliens, but you're also fighting the rest of the humans. It's got a bunch of cool little plastic pieces. We are giving this guy away. Once again, as usual, if you win, you're going to email me at ardwulfslair@gmail.com. Say, hey, I won Invasion Level 7 or Level 7 Invasion or whatever the hell this thing's called. And we'll ship it out to you. If you are not in the U.S., I will ask you to help me with the 50-50 on the shipping costs. All right. So we're not picking numbers this time. You're going to enter !5K if you are interested in the drawing. !5K in the chat. I'll give this a couple minutes to run. So if you want to enter in the chat what it says here, !5K, this thing. Okay. So enter that. In fact, there we go. All right, and we'll give that away, and we'll get that out this coming weekend, along with yesterday's or last week's drawing for Combat Volume 2, which was won by Patrick of Patrick Tactics and Tutorials. So I'll let that go for a couple minutes. Captain Asparagus likes the OG Gamma World. It was actually kind of neat. There was actually the some of the Gamma World background articles in the Ares section were also pretty good. I don't know who wrote those off the top of my head, but it kind of actually worked in Metamorphosis Alpha into the Gamma World background. I don't know if that was a Jim Ward thing or not. There's been a couple of revivals of the Morrow Project, but it was not something that I ever really got into. So, Gen Chaos 33, wrong stream. Love my peeps from the Compass Game stream, but this ain't them. Metamorphosis Alpha was Jim Ward, and I'm not sure who did Gamma World offhand. Paranoia RPG, we have mentioned, it was mentioned, and then I mentioned the computer game, which I'm interested in. I've never played the RPG, and I'd kind of like to have. So some of the original Paranoia modules were written by John M. Ford, whose name you might be familiar with for having written a really good alternate history fantasy novel called The Dragon Waiting, and also for having written a couple of the very best Star Trek licensed novels, much of which were invalidated by like the way they developed the Klingons in Next Generation. A couple of really good books, and he did a lot of RPG content too. He was one of the people that was responsible for GURPS Time Travel, the original GURPS Time Travel, which got turned into like the whole official setting for GURPS, the GURPS Infinite Worlds setting, which is a wonderful setting, by the way. Kilroy did a page through of Morrow Project. I'd be curious to see that. I must have missed that somehow. The shtick of Metamorphosis Alpha is its universe, right? It's Heinlein's universe. It's a generation ship which has gone to shit on its way, and the people on it don't really even remember that it's a generation ship anymore. So it's got like a bunch of weird technology, and yes, John M. Ford did pass away far too young. Brilliant writer. Twilight 2000, that new edition of Twilight 2000 has gotten a lot of good press. There was a lot of hesitation and reluctance. I'm about to run the drawing, so if you want to put your thing in, type in !5K. So, Jeff Beeler, Sword in the Stars SPI. So that is the sci-fi version of Empires of the Middle Ages, and it sounds fairly interesting. As such. Now, I do have Empires of the Middle Ages, and I got to play that yet, too. So, all right, I ain't going to push the button. Let's see what happens. We're going to draw entries. Looks like we got 48. The nice thing about this is it actually tells me, how many people entered and, doesn't count the duplicates and all that. So, Viteus has won. So, Viteus, please let me stop sharing my screen here. So, you have one level 7 invasion. It is a big, really very attractive looking game, actually. The map reminds me, I'm not sure how well you're going to be able to see this, but the map will remind you a little bit of the Supremacy map, I think. And maybe like Space Risk that they did a few years ago, too. So, email me at ardwulfslair@gmail.com, and we will get this out to you if you're in, and we'll work it out if you're not in the US. So thanks everybody for entering. So let's get rid of that. All right. So I don't know how many people we had. I don't really have a way to check that on StreamYard. I mean, I could see what the number is now, but I can't see what the number was all night. So it's something I can look up later. So we will do another giveaway. We'll do 3 giveaways next week. I've got a box game sitting right here waiting to be given away. And we'll give away, I think, 2 pairs of counter clippers. So, which the price has gone up on those. I should really contact them about a sponsorship deal. Um, we're going to have there's a fella who is 3D printing a counter clipping gadget that's actually fairly clever on what was that noise? That was the notifications noise. Yeah, the trouble is I got to use StreamYard for it, so I don't have like all my other ding dongs, like what we're clipping, what we're drinking, and all that other stuff. So, Old Lady Plays, yes. A bunch of people have beat me to this, but that is Freedom in the Galaxy, and it's actually it's a John Butterfield design. It's actually a really neat game. One can, I think, make a case that it is way more complicated than it needs to be. And certainly it's way more complicated than anyone would design such a game for now. But I actually think it's a really cool game that has a lot to recommend it. Dustin Mitchell, first of all, thanks for stopping by. Please remember to subscribe to the channel. Sentient 02970 can't get the Pacific War counters to fit the standard Oregon Eliminations clipper. Okay, so this is an issue with these clippers in general. Okay, and it's less. Hold on. Let's pull the other one out. All right, so here we have the deluxe clipper. You notice it's kind of open top, right? So what you're going to do is you're going to kind of fit your counter in here, and it's kind of completely idiot proof. And you're going to clip, and it's going to nip the corner out, right? So there is kind of a maximum viable height on the counter here, but I'd say that this is a counter from well, it's one of the new GMT counters. There's almost half again as much headroom on the counter on this deluxe clipper. On the other hand, pull my. This is my 2.5 millimeter clipper. This one, I know it fits in this one, right? Now this fits in here, no problem. It's a little snug, but just a little bit, and I can get these counters in here with no problem. But this is my 3 millimeter clipper. I almost said 3-inch clipper. And I'm going to find that these do not fit comfortably in this. So where I'm going with this is on the standard clippers, you can see that there's a slot that the counter slides into. And interestingly, the paint scuffed worse on the 3 millimeter than the other ones. And I've hardly used this at all. Boy, you can really tell the springs really very tight. So what this means is that all three of mine, I have a 2, a 2.5, and a 3. The slot height is a little different on all of them. Now, I haven't found, I've clipped all of this GMT stuff now with the 2 or the 2.5, and they fit fine. But some people might have ended up with a different, batch or something like that where this slot's a little narrower. So they're all kind of different. Jeff Beeler, I believe that the Robert Heinlein story universe predates all this story by a lot. And it's the same basic idea. Albert Salinas, Aliens Invade 1942. So that is I don't know if it was mentioned or not, but there's a Harry Turtledove series called World War, which is basically that exact premise. World War II is going on, and then aliens invade. Jeffrey Benedict, thanks for stopping by. And Freedom of the Galaxy is kind of modular, too. You can play just like one star system or like a whole sector or the whole galaxy. Universe, I wonder if Universe was the collection that I'm thinking of that I read that in. That's possible. The Turtledove series is a lot of fun, but I found that, like a lot of other Turtledove, I think his characters are a little less interesting than his alternate history, and he spends too much time with the characters and not enough with the alternate history. So, Mac Daddy, it is too late. You have missed the giveaway, but feel free to tune in next week, where we will have an additional giveaway of a game and a couple counter clippers as well. So, Viteus, my email is Ardwulf's Lair, all one word, no apostrophes, @gmail.com. Send it there and I will get it. Yeah, Butterfield was, and there's some really interesting ideas. I think Universe as an RPG does not exactly hang together, but there's some really interesting ideas in Universe as well. Yeah, as befits, John Butterfield. So now Stargate, I never owned, never played it. Somebody sent me a copy of Star Trader, a punched copy of Star Trader, which I think is complete, and we're going to bust that out at some point. But that's a standalone thing. You can actually play that by itself. And hey, we might even try Delta V at some point. I wanted Star Trader kind of to get ideas for Traveler. So, 4000 AD. That is not something I am familiar with at all. Neither is Board Game Geek. Unless we're talking, oh, there it is. Oh, I've seen this. Yeah, I've never played this, and this is interesting looking. Let me put it that way. Let me pull this up actually. It's a really interesting box, right? If nothing else. And apparently this was published by Parker Brothers and Waddington's, which I believe is a British department store, if I'm not mistaken. I've never played Striker either, actually. Striker is the Traveler miniatures rules for 15mm miniatures. So this is 4000 AD, and I've seen the box. The box is interesting, right? But then you look at the map, and it's like, I don't know. This seems weird. It's 1972, so I'm kind of thinking it's real primitive. And it's got these tiny little boat-looking counters that I'm not sure I grok at all. There's a lot to like about Striker because you can, among other things, you can build your own like ground vehicles and stuff, which was not part of the core Traveler rules back in the day. Some other like Mega Traveler that was built into the game. There's a lot. So there's an introduction to Traveler video that I did, Captain Asparagus. So check that out. It'll at least teach you about all of the various editions of Traveler, and which have not yet has not yet been invalidated. So. Now, I've also said more than once, I think, that the only like RPG materials, the physical copies that I had back in the day, the early 80s, the only ones that I still have. And I've rebought a bunch, like the D&D stuff. I've rebought all that stuff. Well, not all that stuff, but I've rebought a bunch of D&D stuff over the years, or it's fallen into my hands somehow. But the only ones that I have, that I still have from back in the day, that were mine back in the day, are the old Traveler Little Black books, and the Traveler book, the hardcover, and I think the Starter Traveler too. I have a boxless start edition of Starter Traveler, which was one of the basic sets. You might think that it's like a cut down version of Traveler. It's really not. It's exactly the same content with a couple of very minor changes. Stargrunt and Dirtside from Ground Zero Games. Are those the same people that do Full Thrust? Because I've played Full Thrust and that's pretty decent. There's also I'll mention Iron Crown Enterprises that did Space Master. So it's Rollmaster in space, right? And you can kind of decide for yourself
to what degree that idea is successful in Space Master. But the second edition of Space Master, there's been 3 editions, was interesting in that they kind of tried to like do this like trilogy of box sets that would basically cover everything. They never got to like the merchant roles. That was supposed to be like the 4th box set, but they did the core RPGs in the RPG stuff in one box. Then they did Star Strike, which was the starship combat, and Armored Assault, which was the ground combat. And they had really, really cool and robust construction algorithms in there where you could build starships and build, whatever ground vehicle you wanted, whether you wanted to build a car or you wanted to build a big mech or whatever. It was actually pretty cool. The Ice Starfighter game that Doug is talking about may in fact have been Star Strike, and I have everything ever released for Space Master. Actually, I would not. I have some Rollmaster videos in the works, right? But I would almost certainly never choose to run Space Master again. I am, at this point, I have very firmly landed in Traveler. Oh, okay, yeah. So Silent Death is its own thing. But it did use the setting originally it used the second edition Space Master setting. And then they did something weird with the setting where they blew it up, and then it became the Privateers setting, and they might be the same setting, and I'm really kind of confused about that. Old Lady Plays, we did cover Starfleet Battles a bit earlier. So, and hey, I actually play Starfleet Battles more often than I play ASL. So there's talk of the new version of Rollmaster coming out this year. I don't know how realistic I think that is. On the other hand, if I'm going to do that kind of thing, I'm probably going to do that thing against the Dark Master, which is kind of a it's not really a MERP retro clone, but if you start looking at it with the idea that it's something like a MERP retro clone, you won't be that far off. Chaosium Ringworld RPG module was the game was really good for background unknown space. Albert Salinas, we have talked about Twilight Imperium. I, however, have not played Twilight Imperium 4. I have only played Twilight Imperium 3, 2, and 1. So I don't know. My understanding is they Eurofied it a little bit more. The 3rd edition actually Eurofied it a little bit already. And probably tighten the game up a little bit so it plays a little bit faster. Yaquinto, I believe Timeship was Yaquinto, yeah. So I still have, now these were not my original set. My original set of Rollmaster, well, okay, so the first Rollmaster book I ever bought was a 2nd edition, 2nd batch, I'm not sure if printing is the right word, Spell Law, which I tried to refit into D&D, which was clearly like it was written that it said, you can use this with any fantasy RPG, which is bullshit. Very hard to make that work in a sensible way. But when we started playing Rollmaster in about 1991, I want to say that was, the current edition at the time was the later 2nd edition, which is what we call the Red Spine stuff. And those books we played Rollmaster very heavily for like a decade. And those books got absolutely wrecked, and I tossed them at one point, probably literally tossed them. I'd love to have a new version of that set now. I have since reacquired an earlier 2nd edition pre-Red Spine Rollmaster set. I still have my original Spell Law, though. And I don't have everything for Roll. I did at one point have everything ever done for Rollmaster, but that's not actually true anymore. Because I dumped a bunch of Rollmaster 2nd edition stuff when Rollmaster Standard System came out, and we moved to that. Now, where I am right now is that Rollmaster Standard System is just a little too much. So Doug Sunseth has the full run of Man, Myth, and Magic. Yeah, I remember that. I remember owning that, and that was another one of those things where I didn't quite grasp it, and it ended up going away at one point. I have a very high opinion of Twilight Imperium 3. Quinto did do Beast Lord, and Beast Lord actually was supposed to be kind of neat, from what I understand. Captain Asparagus says that ASL really shines on the early to mid-Eastern front. I'd agree with that. I'd also agree that that's true of OCS, to be honest. Tiny games from the fantasy side. Melee and Wizard, the fantasy trip. So there's an interesting, I think, study to be done that is we're not going to happen here tonight on RPGs that were assembled from the groundwork laid by previous products, of which the fantasy trip is one example. So they released a game called Metagaming released a game called, it's a Steve Jackson design, but Metagaming released a game called Melee, which is a melee combat game where fighters would fight each other in an arena or something. And then they were later released a game called Wizard, which added Wizard to the mix, and they were more or less compatible. And then they later did a book called Into the Labyrinth, which kind of tied the previous two little mini games together into an RPG called The Fantasy Trip. I did not kickstart the New Harden book. I have all the material already, though, which is why I didn't. It's like it's already taken up a lot of shelf space. The binders take up too much shelf space. Rollmaster is actually assembled in a very similar way, where it was originally released as Arms Law, a fantasy combat system for your fantasy RPG, clearly with the expectation that it was going to be used for D&D. Doesn't actually work. It's a little easier to implement it than it is to implement Spell Law. But then they did Claw Law, which was animals, because Arms Law is just like weapons, right? It's just like swords and daggers and bows and that kind of stuff. Claw Law brings in like animal attacks, like bites and claws and tail attacks and stuff like that. And then they later like combined the two into Arms Law / Claw Law, or Arms Law and Claw Law, in a variety of different printings. They then did Spell Law, which was a whole magic system, which was based on kind of the same groundwork, but again, also it was supposed to be like this standalone supplement for, you know, they didn't say this because you couldn't say it at the time of that Gygax suing you, but for obviously D&D, and it absolutely, boy, you're completely redesigning D&D at that point, right? And then they released Character Law, which kind of tied those three previous products together into the RPG that we call Rollmaster. But even up into maybe even into the standard system era, they have kind of kept up this fiction that, you know, I could be misremembering this. Maybe they got rid of this with second edition, but they had this fiction that somebody was going to use this for another game, and you'd still have material in the books wasting page count for that. Doug says that Steve Jackson tried to buy the Fantasy Trip shortly after leaving Metagaming, but they wanted a completely unrealistic price. Yes, hence GURPS. Yes, and you can absolutely see the heritage flowing from the Fantasy Trip to GURPS. A lot of the same mechanical and philosophical underpinnings there. But GURPS, unlike the Fantasy Trip, which was kind of assembled from previously existing components, GURPS was designed to be GURPS from the ground up. And therefore, to me, I think GURPS is a more worthwhile RPG to go play now. Which is not to say that you can't have fun with the Fantasy Trip. You absolutely can. If you certainly want to play Melee or Wizard by themselves, you can do that, and you can buy them by themselves. You don't have to buy the big $200 box. Man, that $200 box tempted me. But I was like, where am I going to put it? I don't have a place to put this. 2 years later, In the Labyrinth, the Fantasy Trip came out. I mean, if you're going to just buy the Melee and Wizard boxes, I think those are totally worthwhile, cute little games. They're not expensive, particularly. And Doug is right. The first piece, so it was already being marketed as GURPS, but the first product that they did was GURPS Man-to-Man, which was basically Melee, but with GURPS. So Viteas says they did a champions and hero for his or her generic system, and I am not that big a fan of hero as a generic system. If the question is, can it be made to work? Yeah, it totally can. I think it's a lot of added unnecessary effort. In you've got this sort of design for effect thing where it's not the designer is designing for effect, it's the player who's designing their character and their character's abilities for effect. It's really powerful. In that you can design a huge array. I don't want to say almost everything, but you can. I mean, it's close, right? I mean, there's only when you start getting into very super abstract sandband type stuff does heroes start to not be able to simulate the kind of stuff that you want to be able to do. But it's really powerful, but it's also very mechanically heavy, and it's got this hex grid based combat that I think is unnecessary. And it's very mechanical. So, I mean, you have to want a game system like that. The great strength, Charlotte Williams, first of all, welcome to the stream. Says, did Unisystem for generic system? Now, that was from Eden Studios. Was it Eden Studios? I thought so. Because they did Witchcraft, and I think they later did the Buffy game. Those used Unisystem or a variant of Unisystem. It was really never a generic system, but certainly they did a bunch of different games using that. The great strength of GURPS was always in the source material, like the historical source books. Or you want Samurai, there's a book on that. You want Mecha, there's a book on that. You want Magic, there's a book on that. So you could absolutely get whatever you wanted out of GURPS. And unlike in Hero, where you kind of had this powers system where you had to kind of build everything from effects, in GURPS, you could say, okay, I'm a magic user and I'll just pick spells off the list, right? You could totally do that. Captain Asparagus, I haven't played Car Wars in eons, but it was a lot of fun when I did. And there is an edition of Car Wars available right now. So not sponsored. Bisnunya asks about the OSR movement. So my own tastes, at least in fantasy RPGs, align very closely with a lot of what the OSR claims to be about. But there are a couple of issues that I identify with the OSR. And those are one that, and less objectionably, that it is overwhelmingly myopically focused on D&D. To the point where there are threads of the OSR that say, we can't have thieves in our game because those were not in OD&D. I think OD&D is kind of a box of rat turds. So that does not appeal to me. And even from a nostalgia standpoint, my nostalgia D&D was AD&D first edition, for which AD&D second edition is a pretty appropriate stand-in at this point. There is, on the flip side, there are a lot of OSR or OSR inspired products that are really outstanding and really imaginative and really help support that kind of improvisational style of play that allows the narrative of the game to emerge in play as a result of random tables and player interaction and game master improvisation and all that stuff that causes the narrative to emerge. Rather than being a pre-planned narrative that is, where there's a storyteller, which is not a style of role-playing game that I like. So I have like a lot of affinity for some of what the OSR is doing. Now, not all of it is quite so myopic as to say, we have to go back all the way to white box D&D. The other issue with the OSR is that there are a number of really prominent figures in the OSR who are absolutely malignant dickbags that I do not wish to deal with or interact with in any way. I'm not going to name the names, but if you're familiar with the OSR, you can recite the list of names. I don't want to deal with those people. And it's unfair to like tar the entire OSR with that brush. But at the same time, it has in fact tainted the reputation of the OSR, because these particular individuals have been allowed to operate more or less with impunity, less so lately, for a number of years. So Adam McDonald says it likes Rollmaster for MERP, particularly the amazing map artwork. Yeah, the Pete Fenlon maps are classics. I was a bigger Rollmaster guy than MERP guy for the setting, for the system, but certainly there was some really good setting material that had been done for MERP. And some of those authors like Fenlon and Terry and the late great Terry Amthor really got the setting and were able to put together credible original material based in that setting. Charlotte Williams made a Fallout game with Unisystem, and boy, that would fit really well. Actually, I think so. And Aliens, yeah, that would fit really. Although there's a new Aliens RPG from Free League now. Jeff Beeler has a little white book that seemed to be a proto version of Warhammer 40k with psychers and bolt guns. I had the original 40k Rogue Trader, which I played and enjoyed at the time, but it was a much less constrained system than it is now. Doug says that one of the best things about Hero is that when you have a character sheet, you have nearly everything you need to play, hardly ever have to look at the rules and play. That's actually more or less correct. I agree with that statement. It's one of those kind of, and there's actually a lot of games like this. I mean, we very seldom looked at the rules for Rollmaster. Our faces were constantly buried in the tables, but that's the whole game. The whole game's in the tables. You have 2, maybe 3 different kinds of tables, and then a fourth table, like the maneuver tables, 4th and 5th table, the moving maneuver and static maneuver tables that the game master would control. This is Rollmaster 2nd edition. Standard system brought in like a million more, but you as long as you had the table in front of you, you didn't have to ever look up anything. And then if you were a spellcaster, you'd have your spell. What we would do is we would have little binders with page protectors in them, where we'd have our character sheet and combat charts. And if we were a spellcaster, we'd have the sheets with the spell lists on them and all that stuff. So we really never needed to look at the books at all. Doug says that OSR is almost all the things that he doesn't want in an RPG, but there are certainly people that love it. There's some product in the OSR that I think is is just misguided. But there's some really good quality stuff too. A lot of the stuff oriented around things like hex crawls and stuff like that, I really like that a lot of that type of material. Viteus mentions the Amber Diceless RPG, which I have played and actually run, or I ran a one-shot of it at an Origin, a LARP one-shot of it at Origins. Brian Gash asks about the acronym. OSR, depends who you talk to, but it's old school Renaissance or old school revival. It's an RPG. It's a D&D largely, a D&D RPG movement that started to emerge with the publication of things like Castles and Crusades and Osric, where, a couple years, maybe it wasn't that long, into the D20 era, where we now have an open license, we can produce whatever D20 material we want. It occurred to somebody, and I don't have the dates in front of me, so I'm not going to credit a specific individual, but whoever it was, it occurred to somebody that they could use the OGL to recreate a previous edition of D&D. And as far as I know, Castles and Crusades came around really early, and then it was Osric, which was an actual attempt to recreate 2nd edition D&D from the OGL. Castles and Crusades was kind of an attempt to not do that. It strips a lot of the cruft out of 3rd edition, like 3rd edition D&D feats and all that stuff. It's all gone. All the skills are all gone. And you have this generic stat roll system that you could run against. You could make rolls against. It was interesting and groundbreaking at the time. And they've done some really good material for it. Now, nowadays, you can like go buy a rule cyclopedia on Drive-Thru RPG in either electronic format or print on demand. So you don't really need to run down a retro clone of whatever, right? Agre Day mentions the Questing Beast, which is an OSR ish RPG channel. I am subscribed to him. He's very good. I mean, I don't think my tastes are aligned with the D&D thing at this point, which is interesting because, you know, the kind of game style that I generally like to do is not very for a fantasy, you know, standard fantasy game. I mean, you might want to do something special at some point, is pretty closely aligned with the traditional D&D play style. I just think there's better game systems for it. I thought AD&D second edition was a pretty bad game system back when the current edition of D&D was AD&D second edition. I have softened a lot on that now, but I still think there's better choices to make. I mean, I've read the whole AD&D Dungeon Master's Guide more than once. It's a great resource, right? I mean, you may or may not agree with Gary on any particular point of campaign running policy, but it's a really good resource regardless of that. And, you know, there is an extent to which Gary was making it up as he went along, right? So, you know, if you want to, and, you know, I say this as somebody who knew Gary, who met Gary, and who played with Gary twice. Hero worship is a bad idea, which is a larger problem than Charlotte Williams mentions Lords of Olympus. So that is specifically by one of the malignant cancerous dickbags, and I will never mention it again on this channel. So Questing Beast is good though. And it's just a ripoff of Amber. So Basic Fantasy RPG is another one of what we call the retro clones, which is basically, you know, again, rebuilding a previous edition, an older version of D&D. So whichever version of D&D you like, whether it's White Box or Holmes or BX or BECME or AD&D First or Second or whatever, there's a retro clone for that basically takes the OGL and recreates that from it. Basic Fantasy, I want to say, recreates BX, which I think is a good place. You know, given the limitations of D&D, BX is a good place for that to be. So, Swords and Wizardry came along after both Osric and Castles and Crusades. I can tell you that. However, Swords and Wizardry did hit it really pretty big. So, and that's a good point. Agre Day mentions Basic Fantasy is free to download. So, and if you search for you Google Basic Fantasy RPG. Dan Webb, finally here. Thanks for stopping by. We did a lot of wargame talk, so that's the work laptop, actually. Nordic Maelstrom says that he finds the WotC D&D unbalanced and power gamey. I'm not sure that unbalanced is fair. Power gamey, maybe. I mean, that's really more of an approach thing. However, there is definitely a less grounded character dynamic in the later versions of D&D, starting with third edition. That is tonally something that I personally don't have a problem with, but it's not my personal preference, right? I prefer more sort of grounded fantasy. I mean, that's why I like Harn. Mike Anthony says too many people deified Gary. That gets complicated. There was a point at which Gary was an absolutely, almost universally loathed figure in the RPG hobby. And then his kind of rep got rehabilitated in the OGL era. Remember that Gary said a lot of really pretty fucking stupid things over the years, right? I mean, Gary was writing actively constantly, right? He constantly had stuff in Dragon and stuff here and stuff there. So he shot his mouth off a lot, and sometimes it was nonsense. And some of that stuff was like really aggressively stupid. So like back in the days of Dangerous Journeys, now to be upfront, right? All of that's not quite true, but most of my personal contact with Gary was in the context of Dangerous Journeys. And then later, a little bit in the context of Legendary Adventures. I still have the copy of Legendary Adventures that Gary gave me, which was, cool. Why didn't I have him sign it? I don't know. He said a lot of stupid things. I do think he mellowed as he got older a bit. It's anybody that says that Gary never said anything stupid is just wrong. Okay. Even in the DMG, there's some like legitimately stupid stuff and quite a lot of rather bad design in that first edition AD&D DMG, which is a gold mine of information and ideas and inspiration. It's a wonderful reference, but you got to, view it with perspective too, right? Dan Webb has getting into Harn and or Harn Master. That's fantastic. Jeff Beeler says likes the Chaosium BRP and Mongoose Traveler. So at this point, at some point, I certainly don't have time to do this now. At some point, we will talk, we'll do an RPG again. And where I am right now is basically Traveler and BRP. And by BRP, I mean Call of Cthulhu and Mithras. I think I would probably not choose to run a game in Glorantha, even though I admire it as a creation. We're not using the same... Okay, so I have a different idea about game balance than a lot of people do. I think it's not important, particularly. Except to the extent that the table allows it to become important. If a game is properly run by the right people, balance is not really a particular problem. Which is something that is, unless it's a computer game, then it can be a problem. But in an RPG, you can like manually fix things on the fly. It all works great. And I don't have a particularly huge problem with 5th edition. It's fine, but it's not, again, tonally, characters are kind of a lot harder to kill than I think they ought to be. So, I mean, we felt back in the days of Dangerous Journeys that we were defending Gary from attacks on all sides. And very seldom, at least me that I remember, did we fall into the back of the, well, he invented this hobby, blah, 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 which is, an oversimplification of what actually happened. I think with the deaths of the principals involved, or some of the principals involved, right? It wasn't the entirety of the idea of RPGs did not magically appear in this communion of Gygax and Arneson, right? There were a bunch of other people like Dave McGarry and whoever it was that did the Brownsteins, and that there was an environment from which those ideas emerged. And, they were drawn forth by Gygax and Arneson, but they were not the only examples. Doug Sunset says that Dangerous Journeys is a really bad RPG. I can't really argue with that. It is certainly, as like a product, it's got a lot of issues. It's also got a lot of really good ideas in it. I'm going to maintain that. I ran that for 3 years. Now, these are monthly games, so it's, not quite as severe as I'm making it sound, but I ran it for 3 years, and it's a bitch. It's got a lot of significant issues with presentation and jargon, and how, it takes days to create characters. Probably the most bloated character creation system I've ever seen. But there are some really legitimately good ideas in there. So Matt Taylor says his late rule set were train wrecks. Dangerous Journey spoke to me at the time, right? I was very into super detailed stuff at the time, and I kind of still am. But I think Dangerous Journeys is that to a fault. If you mean late rule sets, there's kind of three that I can think of. There's Cyborg Commando, which everybody agrees was terrible. There's Dangerous Journeys, which I think the consensus on that is that there's good ideas in it, but it's overall not really worth the trouble. And I would agree with that. And did Legendary Adventures, which is a far simpler system, right? Now Legendary Adventures did not speak to me. Let's put it that way. But it's definitely a different kind of game than like Dangerous Journeys and stuff. I have mellowed with age. I got to tell you, I used to be. You guys might think I'm intense now. You should see me 15, 20 years ago. I'm fucking using that. Oh my God. Traveler is not well balanced. That is correct. But you adjust on the fly as you play. What is important is screen time, much more than character power. Also, you as a game master want to kind of lean into things the characters can do, because they're telling you by being able to do those things that those are the things that they want to explore, or the things that the D6s wanted to explore. Dan Webb says he picked up the Glorantha stuff for reference and world building reference, uses parts but not the whole. That's kind of where I am with Glorantha. There's a lot of really brilliant world building in Glorantha. There's no doubt about that. Mateus says everybody wants to be Dritzed. We had a guy up in Northeast Ohio at one point that literally played Dritzed every game. He would literally not play if he could not play a Dark Elf, Ranger, or whatever Dritzed was. So Chris Dodd says a lot depends on whether you want to game about characters and storytelling or dungeon crawling and beating stuff up, role-playing versus role-playing. I despise that verbiage, actually. You can have both. You can get a good experience out of either one, and you can have both in a good campaign. So Nordic Maelstrom says is talking about balance in 5th edition. It's true that encounters are supposed to be balanced to the players, but you as the game master are not required to do that. So you can make D&D 5th edition work fine, right? If you are willing to do those tweaks. And if you're designing the adventures anyway, what difference does it make? Tim Zales, thanks for stopping by. We're running a little long, it looks like, but that's okay. I'm trying to get caught up to the comments. Agray Day, have I read or seen the documentary on the guy who has run a continuous D&D campaign since 1982 in Montana or Idaho? It is called The Game. Apparently not. I still want to see that Secrets of Blackmore, but you've got to go to their website, and it's weird to watch it. Nordic Maelstrom finds WotC D&D is less fantasy and more superheroes, which doesn't work for me. Superheroes are fantasy, though. I mean, I believe I understand what you're saying, and I think that maybe that statement does not articulate it well. Old Lady Place, thanks for stopping by. Because, it's fantasy. The characters are supposed to have fantastic abilities, right? That is built into the genre. Now, but there's not the switch that says fantastic abilities on, fantastic abilities off, right? There's a spectrum. 5th edition is kind of far along that spectrum, but not as far as, say, Exalted, where characters doing absolutely batshit stuff happens every day. Harn, on the other hand, you've got your very well-grounded, I don't want to say low fantasy. Low fantasy is kind of a bad term, too. And then you've got your sort of higher fantasy, which is kind of where later versions of D&D fall. But really, that's a D&D thing, right? D&D kind of falls in this range, into the high fantasy range, whether it tries to or not. And then you got something like Harn that's more on the low fantasy side. So it's a spectrum, to the extent that it's. I don't think that it's an either or thing, right? Doug says that space opera spoke to him at the time. It's also not a good RPG. I wouldn't argue with that. I owned it briefly and then dumped it. Viteus, Traveler, it's very easy to get your face shot off in Traveler, actually. Dan Webb, Burning Wheel. Burning Wheel is a really interesting and clever system that is exceptionally poorly explained in its rule book. Now, I don't have the latest edition, the gold edition, but I've looked at it and it's not that much better. Torchbearer, which is, I believe, a Thor Olivsrud design, who's one of the fellas that came out of the Burning Wheel crew, it has a very similar philosophical underpinnings and says right in the book that you are not going to understand how this game is supposed to work until you have played it for X number of sessions. And I think that's a lazy rulebook writing, frankly. Doug almost always plays humans in fantasy RPGs. Me too. I've almost always preferred to play humans. Now I got to play Burning Wheel with Luke, and then I kind of figured I understood how it was supposed to be run. Jeff Beeler loves Glorantha's player character races and their backstories. Yeah, it's great. So one of the cool things that you could kind of always see that Glorantha was trying to do and never really got there until this recent edition in RuneQuest, was kind of really deeply integrating you into the world as you build the character. And the new edition of RuneQuest really does a good job with that. All right, and there are ducks in Glorantha too. Doug Sun says, so now we're starting to get into the, okay, you need to have 4 encounters per day type of guy. And even I realize that's supposed to just be a rule of thumb. But when you start sort of mechanizing things like that, then you turn it into a resource management game to a greater extent than I think you should. Now, Mike Anthony, I do like that kind of sandbox type approach where it's up to the players. If you decide they're going to get in over their head, I'll telegraph that. But if they want to get in over their head, tackle the dragon, okay, that's fine. I'm not going to not kill them because they decided to do something suicidal. There's some really good ideas, good powerful ideas in Burning Wheel. And I consider it a major influence on me as a fantasy RPG person. But I say that having played it like twice, but I spent a lot of time pouring through that book trying to figure it out. Doug's playing a RuneQuest now. Fantastic. Nordic Maelstrom, thanks so much for stopping by. RuneQuest in the Elric setting was interesting. Well, you could just play Stormbringer or Elric in that case. All right, so we are about 12 minutes over time. So we're gonna get an unboxing video out on Thursday. I have no idea what it's gonna be. So tune in tomorrow night. Right here on this channel at 7:30 Eastern for the show with Dan. We're going to talk about losing war games, and we'll talk about what I mean by the question of losing war games on the show tomorrow. So stay tuned for that. I would like to thank everybody for stopping by. I would especially like to give a shout out to everybody who has been here, first of all, but also I had this noted and then I closed the file, so I got to pull it up again. I'd like to give shout outs to new patrons, Brian Hard, Dan Barney, and Doug Blayart, and Steve Bolin, who is, I think, back as a patron. So thanks, folks, for your support. It really does mean a lot. It really does help. We managed, and I'll have a cool unboxing for you, an RPG related unboxing as soon as they ship it to me, that I think we will get a good kick out of. So once again, thanks everybody for stopping by. We'll see you all next week.